Well, welcome back. Glad you're back for unit number 9, I guess it is. Wow, we're moving through this semester so quickly. And this particular unit that we're on is called Facilitating Change. It's really one of my favorite units in our whole study of church leadership and administration. The fact is, it's a critical issue. Change is one of those constant issues. We're constantly changing and dealing with change in the life of our church. Change is really kind of it's a crucial balancing act in leadership, because what we're really trying to balance is change and continuity. There are many things in our ministry we want to continue. That's who we are. It's our purpose. It's what we're trying to deal with. Sometimes it's our success, but there's always that issue of dealing with the things that are necessary to change. So it's one of those constant issues that you're going to be dealing with in your church and your ministry situation. Fact is that we have lots of biblical examples. In the New Testament, I think about Paul. Paul was always dealing with congregations that were in the midst of change. Some of the change that they were doing was moving in a way that was doctrinally inappropriate, and he was bringing them back. Sometimes they were dealing with a changing context, and they had to. So those two big areas there, whether it was in 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians and Ephesians, we were dealing with some polity and relational issues, or things when I look in the book like in Romans or book of Colossians, or maybe even in the book of Galatians, we dealt with some big doctrinal issues that had to be addressed. But there was a change issue. Reality is change is all throughout the idea of the Bible as we think about spiritual growth. Romans 12 says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed. That's a change word. We're anticipating that. When we think about the commands of evangelism and discipleship, there's an admonition there that we're to change in order to reach and teach and disciple people. And then when we think about just examples in our own personal churches or in our families, we see this whole idea of change. It's a huge issue, and one that we'll be constantly dealing with in our churches. When I think about facilitating change, really it's how do I manage change and how do I leverage that for leadership opportunity. I want to contextualize it, though, with you just for a moment, because not every church handles change the same way. In your presentation notes, you're going to see some charts. As we think about smaller membership churches or attendance churches, medium membership or attendance churches, then it's churches that are larger, very significantly large. Over the years, we have researched and found that those churches process change in a little bit different way. For instance, in a smaller church, it typically kind of bubbles up from the bottom. As key people in the church see a need, maybe the pastor leverages his relationships with those people, and the change begins to bubble up from the bottom and begins to permeate and actions required. In a medium church, though, it's typically we assign to a committee or some type of ministry team, and they begin to process the need and come up with a plan, and it's kind of like the change moves out from the middle. Okay, the smaller church is bubbling up. In the medium church, it begins to kind of move outward. But when we get to larger attendance and membership churches, typically it's really more top down. Pastor staff see needs and see things that need attention. They develop some type of plan for addressing those needs, and then they begin a top-down process done relationally and well, not trying to be negative about that. They just, they're the ones in charge, and it kind of moves down through the structure. So in your presentation notes, you're going to see some graphics there that show the idea of up and out and down. And just kind of think about your own congregation, where you serve and minister or where you attend. How does that church handle things that need to be changed? When we understand that context, we then begin to think about what's going to be our strategy. How are we going to change something? Maybe it's the need for changing an approach to budgeting. Maybe it's the need for adding some type of ministry. Maybe it's the need to expand your personnel. Maybe it's a dramatic thing like changing the times and locations of services, or maybe even such dramatic as relocating a congregation. Those types of very significant changes. Well, your change strategy is really going to be primarily about balancing logic and leverage. Those two words, logic and leverage. Let me encourage you to think through those with me. When I think about logic, what I'm really thinking about is just being very logical about how you process change. For instance, only try to process one change at a time. When you start trying to change everything at once, it's amazing how complicated and potentially emotionally fragile everything becomes. Logically, I think we want to celebrate every change as a victory, bring some closure, establishment. Kind of the old saying, yard by yard, life is hard, but inch by inch, everything's a cinch. Well, it may sound a little too cute for words, but there's a little bit of logic in how we process change in that way. Most people like it if you give them a good, solid, logical plan. So you want to arrange your change in logical or strategic order. Now, please don't hear me saying this is just a crass, secular approach. We want to seek God's wisdom. We want to recognize that the order of change is going to be different for every church or ministry. And just a kind of a caution here, or a little hint maybe, and that is you may want to call every change an experiment. You know, if people feel like that it's not necessarily we're locked into it forever. If it doesn't work, we could always go back. Well, that experiment word seems to take a little bit of the edge off. Logically, some other suggestions. Let me encourage you to go slowly. It's amazing. We think about things all the time. As church leaders, pastors, and staff, we're thinking about this, largely 24/7. Our lay leaders are not. And so what we think seems incredibly slow may be fairly rapid for them. So watch the speed. Now, what factors influence the speed? Well, what's the distance of the change you want to go? Is it a minor change, or is it a way? It's one thing to change the color of the carpet, significant as that can be. It's quite another to move the building 10 miles away. So the distance of the change makes a great deal of difference. The size of your congregation or your ministry can make a great deal of difference. The relational component is critical the smaller the church. The age of your church. If you've been used to dealing with a lot of change, and there's a long history of that, can probably move a little bit more quickly. If it's a new congregation, or a very established congregation that's not experienced a lot of change, probably going to take some time. And then there's always the factor of the toughness of our leaders. How much can you handle and the pressure and the other leaders in your church? Just a little illustration. When you think about an oil tanker out in the ocean, it takes it 14 miles to turn around. We're dealing with some pretty large organizations in our churches, and it may take a little while to deal with change. When you think about that, build on your strengths, not your weaknesses. When you're thinking about in your church what's working, well, we want to do it better. Quite frankly, most churches are trying to do too much. Simplifying the structure, begin with the vision for the future and not the problems of the past. Well, those are some logical types of issues. But when I said about navigating change, we're really going to have to leverage change. We're going to have to leverage the relationships. And here are some really just fundamental types of illustrations and some ideas. Choose your battles carefully. Don't die on the wrong hill. Some things aren't worth the emotional investment of change. And so choose your battles really carefully. Focus on the most important change and the easiest things to change. And then this one's hard for us. Be willing to compromise on non-essentials. Practically, let me suggest that you be a proponent of the new and not an opponent of the old. There's little to be gained about pointing out the negatives of the past. Let me encourage you as you begin to process to leverage the relationships by choosing some legitimizers. Find some people that are well respected in the congregation. Test the potential change with them, enlist their support, and allow them to legitimize the change within the entire congregation. It's always wise to know how many credits a change is going to cost you. Do you have the chips? Do you know how many credits you have and whether you have enough to spend? As we develop relationships with people in our congregation and have been there a while, there's a trust that allows us to spend those credits even in some difficult changes. Well, we've talked a little bit about the types of change. The big change and a little change. In some ways, we could say that's the scope of the change. Is it a minor change? Is it a major change? Or is it a transformational change? Changing the direction, the location, the polity. Those are usually transformational change. There's another way, let me encourage you to think about change, and it's the type of actions that are involved. For instance, are you initiating some new action? It's something that hasn't been done before. You're wanting to start it. It was a need. So initiating actions. Another way to look at change is innovating actions. You're already doing it. It just needs a new twist on it. It needs a fresh coat, a little bit of change that approaches the way things are need to be acted upon now. And that's going to be a little different type of change. And then there's the type of change that's about invigorating actions, where you've already been doing it. You just put some life in it. We need to hit the blocking sled a little harder, to use a football analogy. We need to bring our energy and our passion. We need to resolve any potential conflicts and those types of change. Now, when you think about change, let me just give you a series of questions that you may want to ask. One of those questions is, who are we? That's the purpose question. You want to ask, where are we? Are we making any progress in our ministry and life and on this particular issue? We want to ask the question of, where do we want to go? That's a vision question. We want to know, how are we going to get there? Well, that's kind of a goals type of question. Most time people want to know, when are we going to get there? That's a timeline issue. There's always going to be someone in your congregation that's going to ask the question, well, how much it's going to cost? That's the resource question. And then sometimes we don't ever get around to asking the last question that's really important, and that is, well, did it work? That's the evaluation question. When we think about navigating change, there's an important question I need to ask you, because change is hard. It's going to be a challenge. If you keep doing what you've been doing, you'll keep getting what you've been getting. Here's the question. Can you live with that? Can you live with that? Absolutely critical that you answer that question as you begin to move into the process of facilitating change. Now, let me remind you, in your textbook, Together We Lead, there is an 8 kind of step practical aspects of leading change. You can read those for yourself. I'm going to highlight them, but just kind of go through that checklist and be sure that you've thought about those. Basically, what the chapter says is the leader is the change agent, but it's not the sole proprietor of change. Sometimes we take our ministry too personally. Take it as a rejection. It's the change process. It's not necessarily, don't see you're the only person involved. We need to determine if the change is necessary to accomplish God's direction for the ministry. It's not just a personal desire, a personal preference. We need to ask if the change is necessary, and is it necessary now to accomplish God's direction for your ministry right now. And also based upon the decision-making structure of your ministry, we need to somehow develop a process. It's not going to all happen quickly or overnight. One of the last things that was said in our text was that we need to recognize that decision-making structures strategize a plan. And that plan needs to get buy-in from key leaders and have openness for the congregation. Let me encourage you to be sure that you communicate the strategy. And that doesn't mean one announcement or one email. It takes a long time to communicate change with our members and our congregations. Then once that decision's made, systematically implement the change, step by step by step. We need to understand that change is an ongoing endeavor. Because of that, we'll have to evaluate from time to time, and then we'll have to adjust our plans to reflect that. Well, change is a big deal. I can almost guarantee there are changes in your church that need to be made. So as you reflect upon this unit of study, let me encourage you to pause and reflect. As you read these pause and reflect questions, not only reflect upon them for themselves, but talk with some of the key leaders and maybe a mentor that you have. Pause and reflect questions. Well, what changes need to occur in your church or your ministry context? What change is already accomplished? Sometimes we need to look and see how was it received. And then, obviously, from an educational standpoint, I want you to think about what new insights about the change process that you have gained from this study in this unit on navigating change. Well, blessings. Have a great time as you think about change in your church.